Thank you so much for the privilege of worshiping with you these last few days. It's just been a joy to be here. Our series the last few days has been on our disordered loves, also known as the 7 capital vices. And we've focused in particular on the false promises of sin. The last false promise I want to talk about is the way in which vainglory tempts us to present a false self. So our talk today will be on the vice of vainglory, which you probably have never heard of. So let's start with Scripture, always a good place to center the discussion. I want to begin with this puzzling passage or set of passages from the Sermon on the Mount. These are words from Jesus himself. The first calls us to be a city on a hill, shining our light before others, that they may see our good deeds and praise our Father in heaven. The second passage, however, just a few verses later, warns us against making a show of our good deeds. So one of the questions I want to put before you today is, how can you show your goodness in the way that Christ calls us to do without showing off? Now, I have a warm-up exercise for you. This is something that I've done with my students over the years, and I get amazingly predictable results. So we'll see if that holds true here, too. Think for a moment about the top 10 most well-known people in America today. Shout them out. Beyonce. All right. I'm getting some very familiar names here. We get names of music stars, movie stars, professional athletes, sometimes even people in politics. Okay, you can stop throwing out suggestions now. Thank you. Now, a little harder exercise. The second group of people I want you to think of is this. Who would you count as your personal hero? You don't have to shout it out this time. Someone you admire, someone whose life is something that you would find yourself called to imitate or admire in some deep and important way. I'll show you the results that my students give me. And again, this is usually pretty predictable. Hang on. There it is. What do you think? The list of celebrities is very, very predictable. I mean, we sort of get new sports stars and new movie stars every 10 years or so. But the list of heroes is so consistent. And what I want you to notice is that the first list, the list of celebrities, are people who have the limelight. And the second list is a group of people whom most of us have never heard of. There usually aren't even any recognizable names on it. These aren't people who make the headlines. They're people whose goodness is worthy of attention, but not in the limelight. So I want to think about that gap with you today in chapel. Now, vainglory is not a word you use very often, or maybe at all. Maybe you've never heard of it before you saw the title of chapel today. It's an unfamiliar term. It's a vice that's not on the list of 7 anymore. It's dropped off. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this unfamiliar vice, this unfamiliar name, and I want to show you that I think you will find that it has a very familiar face. So here's a couple of examples of vainglory. Here's someone you should probably recognize, someone who takes herself to be crafting a career that involves mastery in the art of fame. Maybe a little bit less controversial. You all know this scene from Beauty and the Beast. Gaston, such a lovely show-off and such a dazzling specimen of masculinity there. He actually uses the traditional trope of looking in a mirror, and that's the symbol of vainglory if you look back in the tradition artistically. And here's the version for me and all your professors. All right, we want to be noticed too, but we do it in sort of geeky ways. Desperate to win all those little letters behind our name, you know, PhD and so on. And then here's a form that you guys probably specialize in more than we do. The question is, what persona, what picture of yourself are you displaying in your social media presence? Does it match the real you or not? That would be the question. And last but not least, the form of vainglory of most concern in the Christian tradition that I've been studying. What happens when it's our righteousness that's on display, when we are known in our church as a winsome pastor, or a prayer warrior. Are those masks sometimes that we live under as well? That's something worth thinking about. So I want to begin talking about vainglory by talking about the good thing that it distorts. And the good in this question is glory. You might think, well, glory, that's something for God. That's not something human beings have. But the way that we're talking about glory in this context makes God's glory paradigmatic, but also says human beings have glory too. You notice this in the way we talk in common conversation. We talk about a glorious musical performance, for example, or a glorious sunset. And that term just picks out some good that's on display, something good that's shown and known. So we take glory, which is a good thing. We take acknowledgement and attention and approval that we give to good things, and we distort it when we seek it for anything at all, and when we seek it all for ourselves. So I want to talk about how we mess up glory, and there are two main versions of this. You can go wrong with respect to what you're seeking goodness, or what you're seeking attention for, and then also with respect to the end for which you seek glory, or the purpose, which would be to glorify yourself. So those would be the two different forms of bad glory seeking, disordered glory seeking that I want to focus in on. So first of all, let's talk about the what of vainglory. What are you seeking glory for? And the first case I want to talk about here is a case where you don't actually have the good in question. You're faking that you have it. So you put on display something you don't actually have. So it might be your embellished resume or college application. How deep did you reach for that list of volunteer activities, right? Or maybe you have post-high school athletic exploits that you are now bringing in the glory stories for. Or maybe you're a fisherman and you have that story of the one that got away. All those are forms of sheer fakery. Now, sometimes we actually have the good in question. We actually own a monster truck with flames on the side, all right? And the question is, how important is that? Are we putting the attention that we get for that, does that have a place of importance in our lives that isn't warranted? I mean, even if you have the socially respectable version of this, like you finally got the Mercedes that you've always wanted and you're now purring up to the curb in it, that brings a certain kind of social attention. How attached are we to that attention? And in the grand eternal scheme of things, just how important is that car, right? So something to think about. The next form is a form that I have named notorious vainglorious, and it has to do with cases in which we don't have something good on display, we have something evil on display, but it's so cool that people hold us in awe anyway. So the attention getter in this case is a case where we're doing something bad or even evil. The form that you will find yourself probably most caught up in is what the tradition calls presumption of novelties. And it really just means having the latest and greatest, new and improved, cool thing, and being the first one to have it. So everyone kind of crowds around you and looks at your new phone or the new app you got on it or whatever. And you find that I have to keep updating this slide about every 3 or 4 months because they keep coming out with a newer version of the iPhone. So at any rate, the disordered glory that we seek can come in terms of the object we seek it for, but we can also get glory wrong with respect to seeking it all for ourselves. And I would suggest that there's a secular and a saintly version of this. So in the secular version, as Augustine says to the Romans, you're seeking to make your name great, right? You want to have your name live on forever. But the trouble is we can do a Christian version of this too. In this case, the things that we're known for are, in fact, virtues. We've grown in godliness. So think of one of Cassian's monks, for example, who's gone through the whole list of vices and gluttony and lust and greed and all the rest of them and made some serious spiritual progress. And then at the end of all that says, hey, look at me. I've made some great spiritual progress. Why don't you all please hold your applause, So the idea is that your own goodness, genuine, spiritual, eternal goodness, can become an occasion for vainglory and vainglorious display. So the bottom line is, that whether you have the secular version or the saintly version of this vice, you're so vain, you probably think this talk is about you, don't you? All right, if you didn't get that joke, you get to Google Carly Simon after chapel today. Okay, I want to talk a little bit now about why we pursue glory in disordered ways. And I want to talk about two roots of vainglory here. Sometimes we're prideful. Sometimes we think we have a self that's worth displaying. We think we're all that. So prideful vainglory takes various different forms and manifests itself in various ways. Here's a couple of examples. College football, big flags, lots of hoopla and cheering, and I guess they do it better in Texas. You might dispute that claim? All right. This is another form of prideful vainglory, pridefully motivated vainglory, which you might recognize from the Polar Express. And then the evil queen, Maleficent, so aptly named, in Snow White, who has a kind of unholy trinity of vainglory, envy, and pride. She thinks she's the best. She wants to take out the competition. And she wants to make sure the mirror keeps telling her that she's the most beautiful. Okay, so she's got three vices all packaged in one here. The second form, the second motivator for vainglory is, I think, a little more subtle, a little more behind the scenes. Sometimes I think we're vainglorious and put on certain displays, not because we think we're all that, but because we fear we're not. All right? The fearful form of vainglory has to do with selves that we would just as soon conceal, and then we will put on a much more socially acceptable mask or display to cover up the parts of ourselves that we don't think are going to garner approval or attention. So for women, this is easy to find. There isn't a billion-dollar cosmetic industry in America today because women already think they're beautiful, all right, and want to put that on display. It's meant to be a cover-up exercise. So here's what Photoshop can do for you, all right? It can put on a beautiful mask. For the guys, however, I need to quote St. Augustine, who was engaged in his own kind of, I think, fearful vainglory. And it's an interesting exercise to read Augustine's Confessions looking for this form of vainglory. Here's Augustine talking to his buddies on the weekend about his weekend activities with the ladies, okay? And he says, my real problem is that I was ashamed to be less shameless than my friends when we were talking about our weekend sexploits, okay? So there's a form of fearful vainglory, I think, that can haunt each of us. In the case of especially fearful vainglory, however, what we're doing, I think, is putting on a mask. We're making a carefully crafted persona on social media to cover up the real me. It's a lot easier to put on your superhero costume than to show up and be ordinary, isn't it? But what we long for in vainglory, I think, is to be deeply, deeply known and unconditionally loved just that way. And so the vainglory game turns out to be a self-defeating exercise. Vainglory puts on a show, puts on an outward appearance, gets approval for that, but still finds itself longing to be known as the real self, and to have that be loved, but only the mask is loved, so you don't actually get what you're longing for. Here's what you're longing for. I think what all of us long for, and it's a good thing. We get glimpses of what it's like to be known fully and loved unconditionally in human relationships. And I do think, though, at the end of the day, this is the sort of need that can only be fulfilled in us by God. Now, I want to ask, if we feel the pull and the lure of vainglory, we might find ourselves asking the question, how do we get free of this one? How do we handle glory well? So I'd like to turn to that topic next. I'm going to look at a story from the Desert Fathers. Abba Macarius the Egyptian is the teacher of Evagrius, who's a desert father we've talked about in the last few days. And he's recommending here practices of what he calls detachment from things we shouldn't take glory in. So here's the story. A young monk comes to Abba Macarius and says, Father, what should I do to be holy? And Abba Macarius says, here's his advice: go to the cemetery and abuse the dead. Not your everyday pastoral advice, but the young monk thinks, what in the world? But it's Abba Macarius, so I'm going to go do it. So he goes to the cemetery and he yells epithets at all the gravestones. And, you can even do it by name because there are the names right on the gravestones. So you kind of let those people have it. And he comes back to Abba Macarius, and Abba Macarius says, now that you've done this, what did they say to you? And the young monk looks at him and says, well, nothing. They're dead. And Abba Macarius says, well, then you need to go back and bless them. So the young monk goes back to the cemetery and now shouts out blessings and calls everybody in the cemetery a saint. Feels a little awkward, comes back to Abba Macarius, and Abba Macarius says, and this time what did they say to you? And the monk says, nothing, they're still dead. And Abba Macarius says, and here's the lesson, young man. Like the dead, you too must take no account of either the scorn or the praises of men. Be dead to the world. How do we do this on a practical level? I'm not going to ask you to go shouting in cemeteries. Here's the disciplines that the tradition recommends. Solitude, first of all. Take away your audience and live in a place where you have an audience of one. Solitude is a place where we learn to lay down all the external voices and the voices in our head and listen to the voice of our Maker. The other practice that the desert recommends is silence, and I have sometimes recommended a discipline for my students where we practice a week of not talking about ourselves. So it's not a monastic vow of silence, but it's a type of conversation that refrains from self-display. And my students and I have found this enormously difficult. What we found is that we were very self-aggrandizing in most of our speech and not very good listeners. And so this practice of silence was a way of teaching us to tame the tongue and to tone down our self-display with words. Augustine, however, has a more positive advice. Not only do we need to detach ourselves from glory seeking that we need to lay down, but we also sometimes need to handle glory well. There are many professions in which you're standing up in front of, say, 1,500 people in chapel, and you have to learn to handle being in the limelight. Especially as a Christian leader or ministry leader, we need to do this well. So Augustine is a model. He becomes a pastor and bishop of Hippo, and he tells us the way to do this well. He says, up in the pulpit before his congregation, the food that I'm setting before you is not something that I am taking credit for here. It is bread that I'm serving from the Lord's storerooms, and I'm serving it to you. I eat from the same storeroom you do. It's all bread from him, and all I get to do is offer it to you on a platter. I'm the waiter. I'm not the master of the house. What is Augustine teaching us in this passage from one of his sermons? I think what he's teaching us is that our goodness is a gift. All right? Every good thing that you have that could possibly be displayed for God's glory is already a gift from God. And furthermore, the goodness that we have is a gift to be shared. Right? Augustine's not just eating bread himself, he's sharing it with his congregation. So when we affirm goodness in each other well, we affirm it as a gift from the giver for each other. We can celebrate goodness in each other. We can do so with gratitude. We can be encouraging of each other's giftedness. And that's a way of doing glory well. So celebration is a practice of giving good glory to each other, something that we can do for each other. I want to end with one last story from the Desert Fathers today. Abba Lot went to see Abba Joseph and said to him, Abba, I'm fasting a little, I pray a little, I meditate a little, I live in peace as far as I can, I purify my thoughts. What else? What else can I do to live for God? And then the old man stood up and he stretched his hands toward heaven, and his fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said to him, if you will, you can become all flame. Let your light shine.